That's my walk-up music. Hey, well, thanks everyone for joining us today. The focus of the panel today is really to talk about key trends that we're seeing in digital health, some interesting business models that we're expecting, and really fundamentally how you as entrepreneurs can be opportunistic in this marketplace. We hope this is helpful, this is informative. We'd love to get you guys involved, so please feel free to ask questions. The way that we're going to structure this a bit is each of our panelists are going to give a brief introduction about themselves. For folks that are at companies, if you could just introduce a bit about your company. For Mo and Patrick, maybe just a bit about your investment interests, maybe a couple portfolio companies as examples. I have a few questions, and then we'll just open it up to the group. I actually have lots of questions, so I keep going, but hopefully you guys jump in here. Jef, maybe you can start us off with a quick intro.
Sure. Is this working? There we go. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jef from Basis. So just to make this as quick as possible, I'm a consumer guy, which might be an interesting dynamic for a discussion about the health. Healthcare, capital H, doesn't matter if we can't get the consumer involved, so that's the angle that I have. I've been a consumer guy for my entire career. The company that I was running before Basis is called iFi, which is a wireless memory card. You put it in a digital camera, connected to a cloud service, automatically uploads your photos and videos. Before that, I worked at Logitech for a number of years and did kind of the world tour with them, so I've been doing consumer devices for a long time. Basis is wearable technology. Looks like a wristwatch, wear it on wrist, tells the time, but underneath it's got 5 sensors running 24/7, tracking not just how active you are, but some physiology. What does that activity mean to you and your body? We measure things like heart rate, perspiration, skin temperature, as well as how many steps you take and what other folks do. So that's interesting and data that nobody else gets, but for us, the big challenge, and I think the challenge in consumer health in general, is how do you turn that into action? How do you not just present the data in a way that's interesting and colorful and interactive in a way that consumers can understand, but how do you answer the question, now what? What do I do? And that's the thing that we've worked the hardest on. We have this thesis called Healthy Habits. That's our user experience. It's really just about introducing people to small, achievable things that they can make routine in their busy lives and improve health over time in small increments. That's what we do.
My name is Gutman. I'm the founder and CEO of HealthTap. And for those of you who haven't tried HealthTap yet, try it today. It's a network of more than 40,000 US licensed physicians that will answer any health question that you have for free in minutes or in a few hours, definitely within the day. We have apps on iPhone, Android, iPad, Android tablet, on the web. You can go anywhere and basically ask the question. We have now physicians in 128 specialties in 3,100 cities across the country. So really, physicians everywhere. And they're very, very engaged. And that's the biggest thing about HealthTap. And if you look at what we've accomplished in the past 2.5 years, it's really first time ever getting really big engagement in healthcare, both on the physician side. They're very interactive, they answer your question. But we have millions of people using HealthTap right now, asking questions every day, getting tips. Our physicians are actually creating tips as well in 100 categories, all the way from healthy living, if you want to lose weight, sleep better, if you have some back pain, or if you're managing pregnancy, or even a condition like diabetes or asthma. You can actually subscribe to these tips for free and get them to your phone or through email. These are all tips created by doctors, curated by doctors, reviewed by doctors, and best of all, it's free. And continue with that. I mean, just a week and a half ago, we launched a new feature that I'm very excited about. We brought all the apps, the health apps from iOS, from Android. There are more than 40,000 health apps, believe it or not. And they're organized in iOS and Android in 2 categories, health and medical. And we broke them down to 30 health categories because a running app or a great Basis app is not like a diabetes management app. They're both health, but really have nothing to do with each other. So we brought all of them, broke it down into 30 health and wellness categories, make it easy to find, but most importantly, unleashed 40,000 physicians to rate and review these apps to help you discover the best apps for you. And we call it AppRx, because now they start recommending and prescribing apps to people. Think about the day in which you go to a doctor, you try to manage losing weight, and you prescribe Basis to you and say, use that because it will help you track what you're doing, and your data will come to me automatically and help you manage your losing weight in this case or condition. So very exciting thing. I'm happy to answer questions and hear more from others.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Nice to be here. So I'm owner and partner at Aberdare Ventures, so a San Francisco-based healthcare venture capital fund. Very much the lens of analysis of what we do is around cost effectiveness in healthcare, and I can go deep into that. We've made investments in, I think, 4 key areas: IT, services, personalized medicine, and smart devices. And I come to this from sort of a clinical perspective. I'm a reformed ER guy, then a reformed government official. I worked on many aspects of some of the pieces of reform in general, and then much of the things that I've ended up doing is sort of based on the thesis that in a highly regulated market when the rules change, there's new opportunities. So the first deal I did was a company called Medica, which was got acquired by Optum. So it was a big data analytics company, which is such a wonderful buzzword, but it's really important to know the right business models in healthcare. So that's a good example where that thesis worked out. But at a high level, I'm looking at things such as risk is getting shifted to provider systems, what are the opportunities, and risk is also getting shifted to us, which means opportunities. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Patrick Chung, a partner at NEA. We're the nation's largest and most active early stage venture firm. We're also increasingly unusual in that we have 2 halves to our business, one healthcare and one technology. On the healthcare side, we invest in biopharma, medical devices, healthcare services, and on the tech side, we do consumer, enterprise, alternative energy, semiconductors, etc. And in the last few years, we've seen a real, not even resurgence, but emergence of health tech companies that really take advantage of both halves of our firm. And so examples of that are 23andMe, which I'm on the board of. We were one of the founding members of Rock Health, a health apps incubator to make even more than the 40,000 health apps that currently exist. And a bunch of others that are really uniquely suited to having both sides of that expertise under our roof.
Good morning. I'm Chris Herot, CEO of SBR Health. We have a platform for enabling virtual doctor-patient visits using off-the-shelf video technology. I actually came at this from the communications world and got involved in this business because my co-founder and I were brought into Stanford Hospital to help them with some communication problems. And we realized that the off-the-shelf technology that was there really wasn't suited for healthcare. And the particular market we're addressing is, as was mentioned earlier, as risk shifts to providers with things like accountable care and bundled payments, being able to deliver smaller, more appropriate doses of healthcare over a period of time might be just the answer to keeping people healthy and out of the hospital. But you can't just put Skype on their desk because security issues, and you can't just take a big video conferencing cart that was designed for an emergency department and put it in a patient's home. So we deal with a lot of the issues of how to make it really easy for the patient, and then how to deal with the doctors who are notoriously intolerant of things that waste their time. That's led to some interesting discussions with people about how do you get reimbursed, what are the business models, how do you get paid.
Terrific. I think we have a lot of really interesting perspectives on the panel. So just one thing to help frame, as an initial question, what do you think is a big opportunity in this market? We've seen a lot of attention in the press to digital health, health tech. Some of it's well-deserved. There's been upwards of $500 million invested in the space in the first quarter. Mercom Capital reported. Rock Health has some terrific reports that show $1.5 billion invested last year. What is the big market opportunity that you guys see in the digital health space?
Sure, I'm happy to take it. So I think it's access. I think that's one of the most important things that, even in this country, which we think of ourselves as a developed country, access to healthcare is slow, it's expensive, and wait 6 more months until Obamacare kicks in, and 30-40 million Americans go into the healthcare system, and the number of physicians stay the same, the facilities stay the same, but they will have insurance and they will require more care. And this is in this country. Think about the rest of the world, where more than half the population of the world doesn't have access to specialists at all. Right, so I think that this whole notion of access is a huge opportunity, right? So to give people the opportunity, especially when they have carry mobile devices on them every single day, to get access to care, but not only access, immediate access, but also digital. Because when you have digital access, you can do all kinds of amazing things, like put together information that will help a doctor, for example, make a better decision, whether it comes from a basis-related, information that you collect when you just walk, or from 23andMe, that information that is collected about you in the past, and then it's all digital, it's all there, and the doctor that you get access to from a digital device can give you better information and better advice.
I think the theme that excites me the most is community participation in healthcare discovery. And so at 23andMe, we started to genotype a whole bunch of people, and we thought that that would be the real race that would happen. And one of our developers put something on the site called the infinite question box, and it just asked you silly questions about yourself. What color is your hair? Do you have curly hair? When you eat asparagus, do you smell it in your urine? Do you have a family history of breast cancer? And people were fascinated by this, and they kept answering questions about themselves. And they answered, to date, have answered over 100 million questions about themselves, which now that you've got all that phenotype data, now you can start correlating it with the genotypic data and developing, actually performing novel research. And that has never been possible before. A widespread community participation in medical research has never been possible before. The last company I invested in is one called CrowdMed. A founder, a guy named Jared Heyman, he had an 18-year-old sister. One day she woke up and she just felt sick. She couldn't get out of bed, she stopped eating, and it got so bad that she had to drop out of college. And she dropped out of college for 3 years. Her family took her all around the country to all these doctors, spent over hundreds of thousands of dollars out of pocket, could not get her diagnosed. After 3 years, she finally went to yet another doctor, and the doctor reviewed 3 years of medical records, and he said, well, maybe it's this disease, and it was by this time obviously a rare disease. The cure for this disease, luckily, was a skin patch. She puts the skin patch on her arm. In 48 hours, she springs back to life as though nothing happened. And her brother, looking at this, 3 years of his sister's lost life, thinks that was an idiotic way to do this. So she had 3 years of medical records. He posted the first year of medical records online, and he ran a futures market to diagnose her disease. In a few hours, the crowd diagnosed her disease. And then he said, well, maybe that's a fluke. So then he went out to doctors and hospitals, and he said, give me your toughest cases, the cases that took you years to solve, but that you got the answer to. So we know what the answer is. If there were 4 years of medical records, he posted 2. If there were 1 year of medical records, he posted half a year. In every single case, the crowd diagnosed disease, not always as alternative number 1, but certainly in a short list of 5. So if you can take a universe of thousands of rare diseases and boil it down to a short list of 5, you've saved lives, you've saved time, you've saved money, and this is like a crowdsourced way to do medical research. And it's a phenomenal thing. He's just solved his first few de novo cases that were undiagnosed. He crowdsourced the solution to these problems. And so that, to me, is the most exciting thing. It's community participation in healthcare.
Great. I think we have to choose just one big opportunity. It's a $2.8 trillion market. And we did the M&A analysis since reform. There's been close to $900 billion of acquisitions, mostly by payers. So essentially, existing players are getting disintermediated, so they've got knee-jerk changes around their business models. I personally do less direct-to-consumer stuff. I'm focused more on enterprise. So if I think about hospital systems, they're all trying to become care delivery networks. They're all going to get paid more as a ratio for what goes on outside their hospitals versus inside. So there's a whole set of new opportunities around service models and technologies to enable that, because I think it's a fallacy that these fee-for-service providers, which have been optimized for generations to drive transactions, suddenly overnight are going to manage risk. So I spend a lot of time actually outside Silicon Valley as well, so Nashville, Louisville, places where a lot of service companies have been born. And again, these are sort of slightly different plays, less direct to the consumer, but interesting models around pushing the ecosystem in the right direction.
I would just add that healthcare in this country is about 18% of GDP. Even though it's leveled off a little bit, it's still twice as much as just about every other industrialized nation, yet we don't live as long. Clearly the answer is not making more doctors. It's too expensive and will take too long anyway. It's making more efficient use of the clinical staff that we have and getting patients involved in their own care. So I think that if we're going to bend the cost curve in healthcare, there's a huge opportunity. There's so much money to be saved there just by making more efficient use of the resources that we have.
I'll just add one thing. A huge opportunity that we see is upstream from efficiency. It's upstream from greater intelligence in the system. It's upstream from reform, and it's upstream from access, and that's prevention. I think we're starting to finally get the smart tools that can help accommodate the fact that we're going to have millions and millions and millions more people who are calling on the system for help. I think we haven't had those smart systems 5 years ago. I think we've started to see more, whether they're in the form of 40,000 apps or they're in the form of smart devices. And I think to the extent that we can make these things affordable, to the extent that we can proliferate them, to the extent that we can help the consumer actually drive value out of them. And hopefully that'll lead to adoption. Hopefully we can figure out ways to actually change consumer behavior to help them change their behavior, and that's the hard part about prevention, right? That's the gold mine. So that puts the onus on people like us to help figure out how to change behavior in small, achievable ways over time. And then hopefully if we do that well, that will also provide a huge amount of data that can help improve intelligence in the system and effectiveness and give the system more data to work with once the user is in the system.
As you're talking about prevention, patient coordination, there's infrastructure issues here, there's things that affect ultimately patient outcome. For folks here that are starting companies, do you think the interesting business models that will come out of this will be models that are focused on novel technologies, or really business models that are affecting workflow in the hospital, workflow on how doctors are engaging with patients, or is it really a combination of both?
I think that it's all about engagement, right? So I think that what's missing really in healthcare in general, all the way from really clinical care to wellness and prevention, is engagement. I think that the best business model will come from people that will create apps or devices or whatever helps people engage more in solving a particular use case. And in healthcare, there are hundreds of thousands of them. So helping a child manage their asthma is very, very different than helping an older guy manage diabetes. These are two complete, or helping someone lose weight, right? So these are three completely different use cases. And we foresee a world in which people will have more access to maybe distribution so they can get more users easily, right? They can get validation if they're making a great app. Let's say doctors just validated your app. You created an app and like 2,000 doctors said, wow, this is an amazing app. I want to recommend it to my doctor. Here's a stamp of validation, sorry, to my patients. Here's a stamp of validation. I'm going to actually recommend it to my patients. It's easier for developers to focus on solving one use case that will engage patients, will engage people around something that they can do, and then add value to the system, but start integrating with a lot of other things that collect data and help the patient do more. But I think engagement, because if you look at compliance numbers, fewer than 50% of medications that are being prescribed are actually taken. Right? Any therapeutic that the doctor recommends or a dietitian or anything else, less than 50% is actually, their adherence is really low. Right? So if you have apps that can help solve use cases and people that can focus on solving these use cases, and then they can get help from, like HealthTap, we can help them with distribution, with content, with data, we think that we will see a lot more use cases solved.
So I'll take it up. So I think cool technology by itself really wins in healthcare. So a good example is, there's a bunch of apps and technologies direct to the consumer around how they interact with their physicians, so video conferencing, etc. Not getting much traction by itself. And then conversely, there's an interesting new consumer-driven health plan getting set up for the exchanges, high deductible, lower monthly fee with a set of apps and technologies bundled behind it. So that's more of a solution for us as consumers. I want cheap insurance, and I want to have the choice to see whatever physician I want in a sort of tight network using technology. I would buy that. I'm not just going to buy the technology by itself. So I think that's a good example. Again, in healthcare, we need solutions, not just cool stuff.
Yeah, I was talking to a person that was in charge of putting together a big telemedicine program for a big hospital. And her big complaint about the vendors was that they all came in trying to describe their technology. She said it was similar to if you went to a car dealer and you said, I want a car with 4 doors and a good stereo and leather seats. And the salesman said, well, all of our tires are made of 40% rubber. So technology is certainly essential. I think doctors are probably unfairly maligned for not being interested in technology. They're fascinated by technology. But in order to sell to them, you really have to help them figure out how they're going to put stuff into practice, how it's going to fit in their workflow, and how they're going to get paid or reimbursed, or how it fits in some new business model that they're going to adopt.
Just to go back to one thing you said, Jeff, one thing that was interesting about the business models that are coming out is that the data that's coming out of this is creative, it's going to be useful to other downstream applications. Just to pick on the investors a little bit, as this industry grows and we are scaling both as a company and creating new data that's useful to others, where do you think the money is going to come from to fund the scaling? How are we going to pay for these companies that want to grow and need to grow?
Back to Jeff's point about prevention, I think that this country, in particular, it has a really weird market inefficiency. And I grew up in Canada, so I grew up with a totally different model. But when you think of single-payer societies, which frankly is most of the world, ex-United States, there is a huge incentive to know. So if a single-payer society genotyped or sequenced its entire population, and it was a single-payer society, it would know this section of my populace is at greatest risk for health disease. So we're going to target messages to them. This part is most at risk for breast cancer, so they're going to get screened more often. And when you do that, it's incredibly valuable data because, of course, you're saving not only gazillions of dollars, but also actually improving health outcomes for these citizens. And it's a result of the way that we've done healthcare in this country that type of data isn't as monetizable or as valuable. But we have to remember that most of these platforms that we're developing are not uniquely American in any sense. And I think that's an important point. So I think as we approach with Obamacare a system of more socialized medicine, as you have larger systems like Kaiser, which are basically single-payer societies in microcosm, those players are going to be highly economically incentivized to use the data to produce better outcomes and save a lot of money.
I largely agree with that, and I think one of the advantages of systems, more centralized systems, is there is one big customer for this data. In the US, I think there is still an appetite for this data. It's just extremely fragmented, right? And so maybe there's an appetite in certain government organizations, albeit perhaps less powerful than other countries, or less influential in consumers' lives than other countries. I think we're starting to see interest in corporate wellness providers, right? They want data, maybe the devices too, but they want data to help understand the health of their employees, particularly if it's tied to incentives. I think we're seeing now interest in insurance for similar reasons. We're starting to hear from pharmaceutical companies who want to be able to use this data, maybe as an overlay against adherence data, maybe as an additional data point that avoids subject manual entry of what they're doing in their lives when they're doing clinical studies. So I think there is appetite for the data. It's just far more fragmented here for those reasons.
I think we can define the holy grail for clinical medicine, which is we need to amalgamate phenotype, genotype, sensor, clinical, behavioral data, and then when I go and see my physician at the point of care, so the analytics will run in the background and sort of really describe the personalized therapy for me based on all of that. I think we're really far away from that. But there's opportunities along the way. So a great example around 23andMe, and that's one very specific genomic opportunity. And very similar thesis. How do we move from sort of big population management to precision healthcare? So I've done a similar company, but in a different space around medication compliance. So it drives $290 billion of waste. I actually don't believe that one app or one pill box is going to get everyone compliant. Again, the cynical physician in me. So I did a predictive analytic tool. So they'll go through a population, they'll tell a payer, these are the 5 patients who will always be compliant, stop spending millions of dollars on outreach for them. More importantly, here are the people at the margins, and here's the exact intervention you need to match to this individual. So it's a cost-effective risk stratification play around a huge problem. But again, I think that type of theme will be way more prevalent throughout healthcare as we move to really individualized therapy.
Did you mean compliance or did you mean adherence?
The two words are used interchangeably, so whatever word you prefer.
Because they're pushing for adherence to be taking your medication, and compliance is like a basic pharma complying to the rules. So.
Yeah, in this context, I'm talking about patients taking the drugs.
So you're talking about these great emerging companies that have both clinical applications, they have some big data applications. At the end of the day, what's the exit for these companies? Who's buying them if you're having a successful startup in the digital health space?
So both our firms have done a lot of classic medical device investing and continue to do so selectively. If you look at the acquirers for those companies, they've really diminished because they've all sort of merged together, so Medtronics, etc. Well, the stuff that I'm doing now, so this company, Humedica, could have been bought by a pharma company, ended up at a payer. There was other big data companies interested. So I think the suite of acquirers is bigger. And I think that reflects what's happening in the landscape. Payers are becoming providers. Providers are integrating up and becoming payers. Providers are putting products and exchanges directly to employers. Employers are working directly with ACO. So the whole ecosystem is in flux, which again, for me, I think creates huge opportunities.
And let me keep adding to that. Here's what's cool. Every major telecom carrier that we have talked to has a strategic interest in digital health or mobile health. Each one of them calls it their own thing. huge push for multi-billion-dollar companies to get their piece of providing, very fragmented, disparate health services, driven by mobile phones, driven by apps, etc. Consumer electronics companies are moving in this direction now, largely driven because now it can be monetized as a device, which is something they know really, really well, versus purely digital services. So now there's a whole new category of players that can start dealing with health. Nike is an example because they have the fuel ban, but trust me, the big players that you know who currently make mobile phones and other stuff that you have in your life, they're coming into this space too. And on top of that, we have the usual suspects from healthcare and sort of medicine proper. So I think, yes, there's been some consolidation in some of the classic categories, but there's whole new players coming onto the scene that are either funders or acquirers of this technology.
Frankly, I will answer your question from a different perspective, if you don't mind. I think we need to ask ourselves, what do we need to acquire rather than who will acquire us? And I think that in healthcare is a huge opportunity, right? And in health, and especially in digital health, we're missing some components, right? To make this more scalable, to make the technology better. So we are in Silicon Valley, right? There are a lot of people here that are building amazing technology companies for the sake of the technology, but they're still looking for a problem to solve, right? There are a lot of amazing people around here that are building great startups. Anyway, we made the first acquisition last year, right? And an opportunity at a company that was venture-backed and was looking for something that they did in health. In our case, it was a big directory that they worked a few years to build. Great people, great technology. And we said to ourselves, we're building something amazing. We want to scale it up. We want the data. We're interested in what they're doing. Why don't we go and acquire them, right? And start building something bigger in healthcare instead of thinking about who will acquire us. Right? So I think that there are a lot of great small companies and wonderful people around here that are creating awesome technologies, that are very passionate about what they're doing, looking for a big problem to solve. We have a lot of big problems to solve in healthcare. So we'd love to talk with them.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, that we're all playing in an ecosystem here where even the biggest companies can't solve the whole problem themselves. So you've got healthcare IT, and you've got pharma, and you've got people that are actually dealing with the day-to-day workflow in the hospitals, and all those things need to get tied together.
Starting to see hands go up, so why don't I take a few questions from the audience? Sure.
Can you give more insight on what's happening in the payer space? Any innovation, any disruption there? They have been remarked as dinosaurs.
Yeah, no, happy to. So if you think about a payer and what they've been doing, fundamentally that they're concerned about reform because they can potentially be disintermediated. Not that I think they will, but you've got MLR, which is essentially regulated margins, which is a terrible business for any company to be in. You've got this whole sort of ACO movement, which means they can be completely disintermediated. So again, whether this occurs or not, I think it's a different discussion. They've decided that they need to diversify their revenues. So if you look at the M&A activity from the big players, it's hugely sort of significant in terms of billions of dollars, diversifying revenue, sort of in a 15-degree angle. So United and Aetna have both gone international. United just spent $4 billion in Brazil, a system there. They've all bought other plans to get more scale within Medicare and Medicaid, because again, there's cost effectiveness to be gained by that. And then they've bought all the technologies and services to better manage those populations. So I think Humana is a great example, very focused on all of that, but the international. They're essentially becoming a single-payer system, I imagine. They'll be able to contract or offer better deals in contracting because they've got scale and technology and services better deliver those services, and even buying physicians to do that. I couldn't predict where this will all end up, but I wouldn't be surprised as a proportion of the revenue these payers will be getting more cash down the line from just being an underwriter of risk.
Yeah, I wouldn't bet against the payers. They seem to own all the data. And as we move more towards the ACO model, everybody's going to be jockeying for, and bidding on these contracts. The payers are the ones that actually have the data, probably can calculate more precisely than everybody else where the money's going to be made.
One question on government regulations. We are working on a medication compliance solution, but a lot of rules and regulations as to what you can capture from these bill boxes, etc. Is there any comment on where the government regulations are going and how they will affect healthcare application companies?
We live in a highly regulated market, and so when I was in the government, I sort of started to work with the FDA because they made inklings of sort of regulating healthcare IT, and thinking through that right now. But regulation, I think you can view it in two ways. I sort of take the view that it's a fact, and if you can figure it out, there's sort of competitive advantages to do that. A lot of tech entrepreneurs who I meet who come into the space ignore the FDA, ignore the regulation, and I think that's going to just be a recipe for disaster as time goes on. And I think, again, we can imagine regulations increase because, again, policy, in my opinion, in many ways is sort of reaction to macroeconomics, and the macroeconomics I can't see getting better. 18% of GDP is growing up to 20%, and it's really bankrupting the country, so I just expect more and more regulation throughout healthcare.
Just to follow up on that, one of the things that we see on the legal side among missteps of companies in the space is actually missing the regulatory component. Because of the digital health overlap among different IT entrepreneurs, clinical folks, regulatory is often missed, whether or not it's a device, a medical device, whether or not we have HIPAA issues, et cetera. What do you guys see as the biggest challenges for entrepreneurs in the space?
Well, I'll just say that one of the bigger surprises as an entrepreneur is the capital investment just to get over that first hump. I mean, when you want to rent office space, you might have to have an insurance policy, and that's $500. So you tell the insurance company you're in healthcare, it's $5,000. So there's a lot of those kinds of expenses. I mean, we spend more money on legal bills and insurance than I have in any other company I've done.
I don't know, in my mind, digital health has been really an exciting area for entrepreneurship because a generation ago, if you wanted to do something like this, you just simply couldn't. There weren't the technical platforms for you to develop on. You had to build some giant stuff that I don't know anything about, but you had to build a giant factory and start developing a drug, $100 million in. Today, you can build an iPhone app, like we invested in a company called Omada Health, and based on some Harvard Medical School research that showed that if you were diagnosed as pre-diabetic and you reduced your weight by about 9%, you could halt progression to diabetes. And so they took that and they made a web and mobile community that has an astonishingly high success rate. People who participate in Omada Health's programs actually halt their progression to diabetes. A generation ago, that would have taken you, tens, hundreds of millions of dollars to get that off the ground in some way. Today, if you know iOS development, you can do it. And so when you ask what the challenges are of digital health, I think they've actually come down. It's easier to get into this, and that's why you've seen, I think, a huge emergence of entrepreneurs. The same entrepreneurs who brought us Web 2.0, taking a look at a fifth of our GDP and saying that is a sick, ailing patient, and I can now do something about it. Whereas if I were born 10 or 20 years ago, it would have been inaccessible to me. I would have had to have been an MD, or I would have had to deal with the FDA, or would have had to know about drugs. And today I don't have to do that, and I can still produce amazing health outcomes.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's so capital efficient to start with these companies. I think the challenge for me is, and we've sort of evolved this, the internet's democratized distribution in many industries, but in healthcare, if you're going to the legacy channels, unfortunately, you can't be a 22-year-old with a hoodie, right? But those folks who I do invest in are great technologists and great designers and great UI folks. But what we've done now is sort of marry those people with people who get the healthcare ecosystem, how payments are made, all the malincentives. And that has been a real winning combination. So I think that's not a challenge for the entrepreneur per se, it's a challenge for the investors as well. But it's really creating the teams that can disrupt healthcare outside just Silicon Valley.
Could I add to that? So my name is Stanley Mesh. I'm with Asthma MD. We launched in 2010. As far as we know at the time, we were the first app that allowed user anonymously to share the asthma data that goes to the database. And since then, we shared that with UCLA, and UCSF done some research analysis on it. And we're number one app on App Store. And because of that, we get lots of inbound biz dev deals. One of them is from a very large pharma company, their division in Middle East and Africa. They came to us and said, we love what you guys want to do. Can we partner with you? I'm like, sure, of course. So we agreed on all the terms, but where we're hitting a sort of snag right now is that all these different countries have different laws regarding the data transmission and data storage. So for us to do these deals, we have to put the server on all of these countries individually. That becomes very, very prohibitive. So my sort of comments to your IT, to VC guys, if you can fund IT companies that allows us to have servers on individual countries, like Amazon sort of a web service model, but in that countries, that would make my life so much easier because then I can comply with those regulations and find a deal.
Dr. As your next company.
Sure, go ahead.
Jef talked about telcos getting involved, and Christopher talked about the big payers, and we see like Aetna doing sort of like an app exchange around CarePass, and Verizon could certainly do something, and AT&T, and they're not that far away from that. What are your thoughts on walled gardens getting created around the patient, that you've got to go in through some super big brother to get into, and what are you seeing? What are the trends you're seeing around there? What are the concerns you have?
I think that some of these things that you mentioned think more about the system rather than about the user, right? So what is the problem that they're solving? What is the need that they're attaching to that I and another X millions of people will go to? They're banking on the fact that maybe they have a captive population. If you go to a doctor, then they have you because you went to a doctor and the doctor happens to use whatever system it is, and then you're going to go there because the doctor, no, I mean, it's not going to happen, right? If you have a problem you need to solve, if you have a health question right now, and you need an answer for it, you have a pain, a physical pain, and you have an answer, you wake up in the middle of the night, your wife, your child is crying, I have fever, you want to decide if you want to go to the emergency room, you have a problem. You want to get in front of a doctor as quickly as you can, right? If you can get in front of a doctor in like 2 seconds, that would be great, right? So this is a problem. This is one problem. That if you can solve it at scale, people start coming and using whatever you're doing. And then around it, you can start creating a platform, right? Around it, you can start providing more and more services that are value added, rather than thinking about the platform first, creating like the walled gardens that you're thinking, but nobody's using them. The fact that you have the distribution and the ability to pay a lot of money to build a platform that nobody's using has never worked before. It's always the use case that started the virtuous cycle of creating an ecosystem that is valuable, and then you can actually create the thing that you're talking about.
I completely agree with that from the user's perspective. From the perspective of the people that you're asking about who are generating platforms, I would say our observation is everybody wants to be the platform. Everybody wants to be the health platform, whether you're Qualcomm or Aetna or Runkeeper or whomever. So first observation is there won't be one. There can't be one. The market is just way too fragmented with too many data points. I don't think there will be one. And I think those who do want to be the platform, to take your analogy, I think most of them are less interested in being a walled garden than being a toll road system, right? Like they don't want to limit access. They just want to get paid for the access, right? So whether they're getting paid by a user for storing their data and providing interesting insights, or whether they're getting paid by the system at large for processed insight or data or customer information, I don't know. Each company probably has its own, but it appears to me that many people are chasing being the platform for the purposes of being a toll road.
I would also make sure never to mistake for malevolence what can adequately be explained by incompetence. And that, I think we're inevitably going to move towards a patient-centered system, because that's the only lowest common denominator for the patient. Although today it's often the patient carrying a bunch of x-rays under their arm and going from one doctor to the next. Even within the healthcare organizations, there's fragmentation. So it's not just a matter of walled garden and one payer doesn't want to talk to another one, or one hospital doesn't want to talk to another one. There's been enough consolidation going on in healthcare now that within a hospital chain, they'll be in different systems for ambulatory and inpatient, or between one doctor's office and the next. But inevitably, there's just two forces that are going to move to fix that. One is, as we move more towards a single payer kind of system, there's pressure to get those systems to talk to each other. And of course, that's another long story about HL7 and interoperability. But the other is that I'm starting to be encouraged by seeing more patient-centered things happening, where the patient will take the data with them on a USB drive or a smartphone, or someplace in the cloud. But I wouldn't hold my breath waiting for that to happen.
So I want to share a lesson learned and also a question. My background is a technology entrepreneur, zero background in healthcare at all. One thing that I've learned, trying to figure out something to do in the healthcare space is there are a lot of things messed up with healthcare, but finding something that people are willing to pay for, that is a challenge. Finding that nugget that people are willing to pay for. The question that I have is around the pricing and transparency of pricing. Is there, what do you see as future? We talked about single payer systems, we are still quite some ways from there. Any thoughts on how do we get from here? Next few years on pricing and transparency of pricing.
There's Gaslight.
There's a couple. So there's Gaslight, there's Change, there's a bunch of early stage startups. And I think if you dig into it, I think cost transparency is a great way of getting consumer engagement. Is it a company end to end? I don't know about that. around it. But again, this is the same thesis that as we all have more skin in the game, therefore there's an opportunity for tools and technologies. Price transparency would have made a difference, say 15 years ago, where people had very little skin in the game. But that's the shift which is creating this.
You know, Ron and Jef, you guys are doing a pretty pure consumer, you know, customer-driven kind of play. Is it possible, kind of in healthcare, to just do a pure consumer play? Or as Mo has kind of alluded to, do you need to tap into the ecosystem? And so kind of the question to you two is, are you doing a pure consumer play, or where do you see you guys tapping into the ecosystem?
Sure. So yes, we're consumer focused, definitely user first, before everything else. We have more than 40,000 physicians on the platform, 128 specialties, 3,100 CDs. So we are working a lot with physicians and physician engagement, but frankly, they are there to serve users and patients, like in the real world. So yes, we are consumer first. And I believe that it doesn't matter where we get eventually with the business model. Most important thing is not to get inundated by what the gatekeeper in a big organization thinks the right engagement is, because frankly they don't know. If they knew, they would come to work with us, because there's a bigger opportunity than being the gatekeeper in a big organization. Just saying. So I think that it's very important, especially in the early stage of a company, to focus on the need, to focus on the problem, to focus on the user, to focus on engagement. And in a place where people are engaged without the need, right? So doctors are engaged in HealthTap without getting paid. That means that we're doing something right, because someone else is paying them a lot of money for their time, right? So we have to put ourselves in a place where we need to get them engaged before we get the money, and then add money to the system to get more engagement. That's great. The same with the user. We don't want them captive in a system. You know, EMR say, wow, we're gonna, because we have all this data and patients, then the users will use it as well because they're captive. No, they're not. Right? They use it if it's something beneficial for them. So we, day in and day out, thinking, what are the features that will enable us to attract millions of people? And we have millions on HealthTap that are using us all the time. We're using several people every second right now on HealthTap. If we wanted, by the way, just to talk about business model, if we wanted to turn on advertising today, we would have been profitable. So there are business models. We decided not to do it because we think it's not good user experience. There are other opportunities later that are bigger. Right? So I think that the focus on user experience, before you go and start partnering with other ones, and then you come with a solution that actually works, and they adopt it the way you created it, not the way they think it's right.
Yeah, I would largely agree with that. I think it is important to start with the user, figure out what you can derive that's interesting for them, all for the purpose of driving engagement. If you can't get the user engaged, then the rest of it doesn't matter. But I'll invite you to not confuse focusing on the user and the individual user's experience and making that insightful and engaging and driving long-term behavior change with the consumer is always and obviously the payer, right? So we can focus on the consumer experience, and if that is valuable, then that user experience and whatever the devices or platform is that are driving it will be valuable to the rest of the ecosystem. So in our cases today, the consumer pays because that's the speediest and most efficient way to market for us. It allows us to avoid things like FDA and HIPAA and other things that would be high friction. Not impossible, but high friction and high capital cost for a business that's just getting up off the ground. But over time, if we create the right data, if we create the right insight, if we show that users using our system stay engaged with their health and make small changes over time to get healthier, that will be tremendously valuable. And then the payer becomes, as I said earlier, the corporate wellness provider, the insurance provider, the pharmaceutical company, whatever it may be that's trying to incent and essentially subsidize the behavior change that lowers our overall cost.
Yeah, that's a really important point, that especially in healthcare, the connection between the action that you perform or the service you deliver and who actually pays for it can be a long and rather convoluted chain. And the classic example is you do something that causes the patient to get better, and then the payer ultimately saves money, and hopefully they'll pay you to do that. Although most of them are sitting on their hands waiting for the data before they'll do that. Just as an example of one really interesting business model that we saw was, in telemedicine, it's very hard to get reimbursed for a telemedicine visit because the insurance companies assume that they didn't pay for phones, why should they pay for video? But what we found is you can sometimes get a nursing home to pay, say, to have a neurologist do a consult, because then they can take a more expensive class of patient and they can bill Medicare for a more complex caseload. So the financial benefit is oftentimes several steps removed from the service you're delivering.
So in this time when there are so many startups kind of vying for a patient's limited time, what have you found to be successful in first, I guess, acquiring that customer and then really retaining them when so many companies are addressing overlapping pain points?
For us, it's access. I mean, the number one thing that resonated with most people, with most of our users, and we're serving millions of people now, right, is this whole notion of giving you immediate access to physicians to ask a question, someone that you trust, in the moment of need, and make it quick, because immediate gratification in health matters like it matters in games, right? We want immediate gratification, especially when we have a pain point, right? So I believe that access is a big key here, right? In getting engagement, in getting this initial engagement in the system, and also getting data into the system. Because when you need something, you provide basically the information about what is bothering you, what is the thing that you're concerned about, what are you dealing with, right? And this piece of data is extremely valuable to help you get through the system. And I think that, thinking about Obamacare, thinking about the world in general, building a triaging system that will enable us to basically take people, rather than they go to the web and get lost in sites, like information sites, content sites like WebMD, or like all kind of like, message boards, kind of Web 1.0, old style stuff that they're going and reading an article. What if we had like a triaging system that people got into with the need that they have, with the question that they have, and being directed into the right level of care, whether it's immediate access to a physician that they can see, or to a test that they need to get, or to a service that they need to get very efficiently, rather than get lost in a media site.
Yeah, let me qualify my previous comments, which I think will answer your question. So I'm not anti-consumer. What I'm pro, though, is getting to consumers via established channels or new channels emerging. I just think the notion of selling something direct to the consumer around, say, as an example, an app, is just difficult. So a cost transparency solution, selling directly to individuals, I think that's a hard business model. But selling a sort of cost transparency solution intermingled with other things around benefit design via their employer or via their payer or via the new exchanges, that just for me is a lot more tangible. And to your point, I've seen that work because you get just quick attraction. Again, if you think about our mind share on a daily basis, we're all basically pretty healthy. How often do you think about, shit, I need to buy something for my healthcare, right? Versus, I've started a new job 2 months ago, here are the things I have to do, I've got some options, and that's when I'm engaged in making those decisions. So if I can sell interesting sort of health, wellness, prevention stuff at that time, intermingle with benefit design, it's just going to get a lot more traction.
So, Patrick, just to follow on that, actually, go ahead.
I was just going to disagree. Panels are always more interesting when you disagree, right? Obviously, there's a tremendous amount of truth to those comments, but as we look at the consumer space, one of the ways we think about it is, where are consumers showing intent? Set aside behavior for a second. Where are they showing intent? They're downloading millions of health apps every month, some of them paid for. There are subscriptions to healthy living and men's health that people are paying for. There are millions of people every year who join the gym. Set aside whether they go. They're showing intent, and in many cases, they're spending money. So I think as we look at that, clearly this doesn't touch everybody, right? There's 30% of consumers who are not part of the crowd that we're talking about right now who's going to be really, really hard to get engaged. But there's a huge audience that is already showing intent. The question now is, how do we be one of the options they consider to show their intent? Consumers, especially in America, are looking for silver bullets. How, with great smart technology, can we be perceived as the easy way to finally do something that you know you should have been doing for a long time? And the second part of your question was, once you get them, once you get the acquisition, how do you sustain them? And I think part of that is embracing the thesis of what everyday real life is like for people, and it is not the life that we read about in fitness magazines. So every program that you approach health, especially in the consumer space, every time you approach it with this sort of very prescriptive, very regimented approach to how you're going to change your life, it will fail within days, if not weeks. So you need to start with this is what real life is really like, right? People need gradual nudges in the right direction, and they need to be rewarded accordingly, so we can talk about gamification and all the reward mechanisms. And they need to feel a sense of progress, perhaps digital progress, but they need to see a sense of progress before they can measure that progress at their waistline, right? So that's how I think we acquire them and how we sustain them until it gets traction.
Can I just ask you?
Instant gratification, right? But when you acquire a user, there has to be instant gratification for them to be engaged in your product, and then worry about the frequent and the further use. If you don't have that instant gratification, that's lost.
I agree. Yeah.
A question here, if I could. Hearing people talk about, is there something that the customer is willing to pay for? At this point, it's laughable and tragic to me, because I've become a part of this sort of very preventative focused kind of biohacker community, and I've just been astounded at the amount of data that can be collected about the human body. And so just the myriad of tests that you can have run that offer some data point, that you go to a doctor and they may not prescribe it, they don't know to prescribe it in many cases to run the test, and not up on the latest tests that ought to be run. As a consumer, if I find out about these tests, I'll try to buy them. Like, I'm just trying to hand somebody some money, and they don't know what to sell me because I'm not using my insurance, and that's bizarre. And can I even be trusted with this information? Because should my doctor be asking for it? And so it's just like, as an entrepreneur who's just kind of fallen into the health world, it's just foobarred, right? Like, there's products that people don't know about that already exist, that have been around for 12 years, that they can't buy, and so on and so forth, right? Like, is it regulatory? Is it technology? What needs to break here so that this bottleneck kind of...
That's a great point. So, and I'm sure we'll have different opinions here. So I think there are some sort of characteristics of the healthcare market which technology can sort of help mitigate. So first of all, asymmetries of information, right? So you're obviously a highly intelligent, very engaged individual. It took you time to find out those tests. There's other people just as smart as you who are not looking at it, so they just don't know. So that asymmetry is someone who's just done medical training versus not, that creates a barrier, right? And then there's long time lags between decisions that we make and then the outputs on our health, right? So technology, I think, can mitigate both of those, and it's starting to happen, but we're not fully there yet, which is why the market's not as efficient for many other reasons as well.
Yeah, I think there's also a real danger to look at this room and think this is all representative of the people that are the consumers of healthcare. I mean, if you go to a hospital, you look around and you don't see people like this.
Yeah, go to ER 3 o'clock in the morning. You'll see how doctors behave, and again, it is not rational, as you can imagine, and you'll see how patients...
And I mean, one thing to keep in mind is something like 80% of the healthcare dollar is spent on a handful of conditions. So we're all talking about rare diseases and tests you can get, but all the dollars are spent on diabetes, congestive heart failure, chronic conditions.
Yeah, 70%.
Yeah.
But isn't the question, he wants to buy a test, he is not able to. Why is he not able to, though? Why won't the purveyor of the test sell it to him?
Yeah, that's a great opportunity because this is a growing trend, and I'd sort of argue that wasn't sort of as prevalent before, so there's no one servicing the needs of those individuals. But that's absolutely changing. And then we've all done sort of stuff within that space. Again, more engaged consumers means more opportunity.
There's also, there's two other questions here. One of them is incentives, like who's incentivized to actually do it and why, right? And the second thing is really the knowledge and the need, right? So if everyone knew that these tests are there, would everyone run to get tested? Because in healthcare, people are reactionary, right? People don't tend to manage their health before something happens. And we want to try to change it, and I really think that we can with some new things that are coming up in the market. But for now, most people are reacting to health. They manage health when it happens, right? So I think that what is possible to do is create a place where people come to manage a certain thing, and then they start interacting with the physician that he becomes more knowledgeable, right? And incentivized, and that's very important. Why would they be incentivized to send more people to actually get tested for the right things and not increase cost? Rather than decrease cost, because the problem with the system right now is too high a cost, right? If there are tests there that can actually reduce cost or make people healthier, right? Either better outcome or lower cost, that's fair, but then you need to incentivize the physician to give it to the patient at the moment when they perceive a need. And I really encourage people here to read about the readiness for change. It's a very interesting theory by Prochaska, talking about when people are ready to move on things that are related to health. And that's not 100% of the time. Think about yourself.
What's the book? Hold on one second.
It's a researcher called Prochaska.
Hi. We've been talking a lot about users or end users as individuals. And I would welcome your opinion on accessing users that are physicians, especially because of the EMRs as the gatekeepers. And your opinion on, do you see them as being integral players in the future, or will they be replaced by another kind of ecosystem?
I think I can answer that in two ways. So last year, for the first time, we now have more salaried physicians, more than 50% in the US than before. So physicians are increasingly not making purchasing decisions, especially for sort of expensive medical devices. So the way that we distribute technology in healthcare is changing. Physicians have to buy in, absolutely, but it's not just going to be based on what they want to use and they get paid for it. So that's one big change. And then the second, and I think you alluded to this before, we've got more people going in the system, we've got more elderly people who need more care, we haven't got enough physicians. And as a physician, I'd argue there's no data out there that says chronic disease has to be managed in expensive hospitals by people like me. And that's what really needs to be flipped. How do we use care coordinators, other skilled workers to more cost effectively deliver healthcare? How do we imagine one physician looking after a panel of larger patients using other pieces of labor? Improving the labor productivity, I think, is a huge opportunity in healthcare because it just hasn't done that in the last decade. It's actually gone down.
Can I ask the panel a question? Coming back to something that Mo said about you doubt reaching consumers directly. You would prefer that consumers got access through these distribution channels like payers, etc. In the last few years, we've seen almost, I'd say maybe 50-ish% of the startups that we see in the healthcare space will say something to the effect, we are being trialed at Humana, we're being trialed at United Healthcare, we're being trialed at Kaiser. And it feels like all of these payers are just letting 1,000 flowers bloom, and there are these pilots that go on forever. And so my question is basically, what does a startup have to do to break through, to be deployed system-wide, and what are the greatest examples in your mind of a startup, or in your collective minds, all of you who are in startups, of a startup who has actually successfully distributed and come to a large swath of consumers through one of these channels? How do you break through that barrier?
That's a great question. So I'll give you some anecdotes. Perpetual piloting is now, unfortunately, a real issue in the ecosystem, right? So before it used to be evaluation sort of metric, and now that anyone in the dog can get a pilot, so it means absolutely nothing. Breaking that barrier is harder. An interesting model that I've seen work, and we're working on stuff like this, how can you actually launch your company with an existing partner? So you can go to revenue like that. So there's an interesting company called A Labs down in San Diego. The creative guys in New York started it and took it to 200 million within how many months, right? So there's a 12-month period before you set up the company, but you're working with an established partner, solving a real unmet need they have, and you totally mitigate some of the execution risk because you go straight to revenue. So I think those are some of the interesting models you can do on a non-science-based theme. So when it's sort of real commercial execution, great. I think if you still have sort of core IP and technology, it's still an issue. If you're selling to those providers and payers with a technology thesis, then it gets even more difficult.
I think that one of the problems here for a lot of entrepreneurs is not just trying to come up with the appropriate metric of how to succeed. Really what it is I'm going to bring back the model of what happened in the financial industry, the onset of modern networking. For the financial industry, we had enormous numbers of great ideas in the 70s. And what happened was the noise that they might create was larger than the signal. And that's caused a lot of fear, a lot of apprehension. That's what slowed down the evolution of things, of trying to bring on technological change in a big way. And that was because it was the fear of what would happen bad if we let this thing go out of control. And when you're an entrepreneur, all you can hear is, like when you mentioned earlier, the opportunities that could possibly occur if X occurred. Well, you have to at the same time say, and this is the noise that will come along with that particular signal, and that they'll be afraid of these things, and you have to conquer this while providing that. If we talked in such a manner, an entrepreneur would get a balance and not just have the enthusiasm, well, I can conquer that particular mountain. I have to, however, bring along the supplies to survive to the top of the mountain to get that way. That's the hard part for making entrepreneuring in this area really work, because people out here, they don't realize what they're up against a lot of times is this absolute fear. So when this gentleman was going to try and get his test, why was he not getting that test? He was not getting that test sold to him because there was a fear of an unintended problem that would result, that would cause a liability for the person who was supplying that particular thing. So these are the costs to our industry of not being able to access the market with all sorts of new opportunities. We've got to find a way of dealing with the noise as well as the signal. And then we're in, like the financial industry, in a high growth situation of bringing on electronic technologies and new software technologies and new ways of connecting customer base.
A lot of the regulation that prevents customers from getting data on themselves predates the internet, where you couldn't do any research about health conditions really in an effective way. And just a really silly, fun example, here in Silicon Valley, you can go have a DEXA scan done for $85. You can walk into a boutique, they show you your bone density and your body fat percentage in a very accurate way. Outside of Silicon Valley, you cannot get a DEXA scan. And if you try, they'll say, we need a doctor's order, and the machines are only at universities, and they'll say, and you say, why can't I just buy this? First of all, they'll say, well, it's $600, you know, with insurance and so on and so forth. They'll say, we can't handle the liability of me knowing my own bone density, right? It's just insanity.
So right now, who are the better recommenders? The person who lost 40 pounds doing a Fitbit, or the doctor who says lose 40 pounds or you die? And where's that going in the future in your view?
It's pretty clear that the doctor telling the patient they're going to die has no effect. You give them a little gold star and you'll get them to do things, but tell them, you know, I mean, look at how long it's taken to get people to quit smoking.
I think it's a combination. I think yes, compliance, adherence, whatever you want to call it, but it's a problem for sure. But I think that it's a combination. I think that there's something very valuable in a concept of a coach, right? And I don't think it's either the doctor or the patient himself. I think it's something like a virtuous cycle. So think about the world, right? In which you're going to go to a doctor or some healthcare professional that you trust, and I think that trust is the key word here. Because you know what you need to do. I mean, nobody needs to tell you that. But there's someone there that you trust that will tell you, no, this is the right path for you to go. So here's a prescription of something that you may need to take. And here's an engagement mechanism, maybe an app, right, that you can use when you don't see me. When you use it, the data will be collected somewhere in the background and somehow come into a place that I can monitor at any given point in time. But what's interesting in this kind of a circle is that I, as a patient, when I got this advice from the doctor, I will have in mind that I need to be accountable for him, because or for her. I need to go back to them after a week or something like that, and I will need to face them. And I can't really bullshit them and say, no, I did that, believe me, I took this medication, but there's something there that is actually collecting information about me that I'm incentivized to actually keep right, because it makes me better, but they will keep me accountable for that, because I'm going to go back to them and the data will be in their hand, right? And like a virtuous cycle, it has both the app and the doctor and yourself trying to make something happen in a cost-effective way. And I think it's a much better world.
I think there's some interesting experimenting going on right now in what is the most powerful, maybe not recommender, but maybe motivator. I agree with the observation. Doctors have been giving us advice for a long time that we choose not to take. But I think one of the powers that comes out of people who, whatever it is, lost 40 pounds or whatever their thing was, part of the power that comes out of that is there's somebody I know who actually did it. So it's not fiction, it's not sort of theoretical. I've seen somebody do it. But I think especially in corporate wellness, we're starting to see experimentation right now in what are the right incentives. We're seeing some people who are applying financial incentives, right? Whether it's credit at the company store or actual savings in premiums or whatever. I've talked to some in this space who are finding actually the financial incentives to you individually are not nearly as motivating as peer pressure for a team that you're part of, and your accountability is really to them. I don't want to fail them, or I don't want our team to fail because of my poor performance. And I'm hearing from people that gamification applied in that way and creating sort of peer accountability is far more effective than even individual financial gains, and certainly more effective than the promise of better health down the road. So who knows what the winner will be, but I think there's a lot of interesting experimentation going on now.
So, Mo and Patrick, question for you guys. We're talking a lot about user engagement, developing distribution channels, creating enterprise opportunities. What metrics are you guys using as you analyze investment opportunities in these companies?
I'm looking at one simple one, revenue.
Yeah, keep your eye on the money. But to that point, you know, the flip side of that is why do we have to convince people that losing 40 pounds is a good thing? Why does your doctor have to tell you that you're dying? It's because they're trying to counteract this huge weight of other messages, of junk food suppliers, of television, of, like, you know, if you go to, you know, just choose almost any other industrialized nation out there, France, Canada, the UK, Australia, you know, Japan, you know, they're just healthier. You know, the baseline is just somehow, you know, they're just living better. They're not eating potato chips and sitting on the couch so often. And so, yes, you have to kind of try to, deliver preventative messages. But the other thing that I think is really promising is this stuff like Mayor Bloomberg is doing, just going after the bad influences that we are reacting to. If you just take away those bad influences, you would have less to react to.
Yeah, I'd say we've been extremely successful at making people fat.
Yeah.
We've subsidized oil production, we supersize the drinks, we advertise on TV. So those same mechanisms, we should have to find a way to work them in reverse.
Right.
But I think one of the more interesting examples that doesn't come from healthcare is in energy conservation. That the thing that turned out to be most effective was not telling people how much money they were spending on electricity, but telling them how much more they were using than their neighbors.
Yeah, one of our companies, O-Power, does exactly that. With your utility bill, you get a gamified scorecard that says you're wasting 20% more electricity than your neighbor who has the same size house you have.
I'm hearing a little bit of a parallel between digital health and pharmaceutical, in that, at least what I'm hearing is that there's 40,000 apps, growing number of apps. I, as a consumer, will never choose between 40,000 different apps. So do you think there's a channel or a future of digital health where there's large digital health companies that actually go out and bother to prove that this application works better than that application?
HealthTap.com.
And end up on a formulary, and then that formulary delivers those applications to doctors for distribution, and it compensates the doctors for pushing those out to patients.
I think that doctors themselves will learn to teach other people about these applications, and if we show it to the doctors, this is what we showed, and I really encourage you to go and check it out because it's really cool. I mean, we did it as an experiment about 6 months ago, right? We wanted to see if doctors actually would be interested to look into this, 40,000 apps and choose out of them some that they think they're better. Because, you think, they're busy, they have time, there's just something in it for them to do that. And what we realized is that something really interesting, that we don't think about it. We keep thinking about doctors or patients. Doctors are people. They also use these apps. They also have kids, and they take care of their parents, and they actually are consumers of these apps. So they have kind of a dual kind of role here. So they're curious about the apps for two reasons, right? So they're actually, if you look at it, we have now thousands of doctors that daily go and rate these apps and basically help you find the best apps for you to solve something that they're well known for, they want to help their patients solve. So there's a beautiful virtuous cycle there that they are educating their peers, right? So that's kind of the cool thing to do. So they kind of talk about it with their peers. So there's kind of education within the physician network, but also they recommend it to users in the realm of what they have an expertise. So we have this notion that's called known for, and doctors get from us apps that they're where we tag these apps and we serve them apps to review that are within the realm of expertise. So there's a beautiful virtuous cycle there. I really urge you to download the app and check it out.
Yeah, I wonder, Ron, do you know, when I talk to doctors, what I hear is that their patients are educating them about the apps. Do you have any data on that?
I don't have data on that because we're not doing it this way, but what we did is created the directory, broke it down to 30 different categories, make it easy to discover, and serve them apps. Now that we have more data about who's reviewing what app, we're able to create virtual cycles. But I think you're right. I think that patients do educate doctors.
My background is not in technology at all. My background is actually more biomedical, clinical research oriented. So when I listen to all the ideas that are being thrown around and being considered, I kind of think of it a little differently. I think of, okay, well, if I'm a doctor or if I am a representative in the pharmaceutical world, how would you be able to solve my problem? So it's, a couple of things came to mind. One is, how are you able to make whatever technology you have customizable? Because when you're thinking of doing clinical research, for example, what you may need to collect, data that you need to collect may be very different for an oncology study versus one that is an infectious disease. The things that you measure will be different. And when you're thinking of, say, conducting a global trial, I remember having experience of conducting a study in Turkey that that local or that country requires that you measure or that you report the volume of blood that leaves the country every year. I don't know why, but that's just sort of something that you have to, a metric you have to collect. So that's just an example of, okay, specifically, how are you going to customize your technology so that for Turkey only, you're going to have to do this extra thing without having to put in a lot of time and effort and all of that. The second thing I thought of is how are you able to validate and prove that the data that you're collecting is really, well, not only at a time point when you collect it, but also how are you going to report it, I guess, how are you documenting it? Because it's a big thing in pharma and in research. It's one thing to kind of just collect the data and do some simple analyses and go, oh, well, that's interesting. If you eat more of this, that's what's going to happen. But if you're trying to link that information and kind of think about, well, what does that mean in terms of efficacy of a disease or efficacy of a drug, and you're trying to then send this information to the FDA as part of your application, that's a totally different story. That is, you have to be able to show and prove that, okay, this is validatable. And I'm not so sure as you're kind of, inventing all these apps and whatnot, that would necessarily be a big component, of your planning, I guess, because maybe the regulatory side of things you're not really kind of thinking about as upfront. And then thirdly is how are you able to engage the people that you're collecting information from, most of your patients? How do you, it's one thing to kind of go, okay, well, what is your blood pressure last week? Or how many times did you go to the gym, how many hours did you spend last week? But it's very different, than if you're trying to collect information on your white blood cell count, from your latest lab report, because you have brain tumor, because you have HIV, and really touchy-feely topics that are very personal, very sensitive. How have you navigated through all of that, those, constraints and concerns and sensitivities around all of this? Sorry, it's kind of a long question.
Let me take numbers 2 and 3. I don't remember number 1. I just do this by way of illustrative example. At 23andMe, what we did is, as I mentioned, was we genotyped a whole bunch of people, and then we started to get them to answer phenotypic questions about themselves, and to date they've answered over 100 million questions about themselves. Number one, people love to talk about themselves. And your question is very good. Is self-reported results, how valid and validatable are they? And so the first thing that we did was we replicated over 150 genome-wide association studies. These are the studies that say, you read the newspaper, they've discovered a gene for male pattern baldness or Alzheimer's or breast cancer or whatever. And the way those happen, as you probably well know, is you get a cohort and you follow them through time, and doctors, take measurements every single day, and it's incredibly expensive. And a very robust cohort is about, single-digit thousands. So if you have 5,000, 10,000 patients, which is incredibly expensive, takes tens of millions of dollars, often 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years to come to a result that says, we follow this cohort across time, we can validate that if you have this gene, it's very highly correlated to this result. We replicated over 150 of those genome-wide association studies with self-reported web data at 0 time, at 0 cost. And we published all of those results, and we also published the meta result, which is that self-reported web data is actually in the tolerance bar of the clinical gold standard. And probably, my guess is that because we did this across hundreds of thousands of people, not single-digit thousands, our results are probably more accurate. And so that is something that was kind of deeply both shocking and reassuring to us, because it proves that you can actually do significant validatable research in this way. Now, will the FDA accept that self-reported web data? Not yet. Maybe I'm living in a la-la land, but I think one day with so much data about how this actually does work, we're going to get there.
So just to follow up, how are you finding out the likelihood of getting buy-in from the regulatory authorities? Because it seems to me that the design and the tweaking that you got to do, you kind of have to have the end in mind in order for it to be marketable to pharma or some other.
I think that's going to be a very long discussion. But in the maybe medium to long term, just the weight of compelling data, I think, is going to be so obvious that people will be like, well, I could wait 10 years and spend tens of millions of dollars for this result, or I could query my database, hit return, and get the same result that has never deviated from the clinical gold standard in 100% of the cases, and I could get that.
So Patrick, I know there was some controversy earlier with 23andMe about whether you could even sell the results to consumers. So that feeds into the question that came over here. How did that get resolved?
Well, we're still operating in, I think, 49 or 48 of the 50 states and several dozen countries. So we've got so far so good.
Sure.
My name is Denise Terry, and I'm with OB on the Go, and we really focus on sort of maternal fetal health because we believe that the first 1,000 days of a human being's life is critical for determining the health of the rest of their lives, and that mothers are really an important role from the time of pregnancy onwards for what she does during pregnancy, and she's extremely highly motivated, I would say, to take care of her own health as well as the health of her baby from the time they're not. I'm just curious what any of you are doing to focus on mothers or pregnancy specifically to address some of the behaviors that can start sort of in the womb and in early childhood, which we feel mothers are the key to family health.
Yeah, it's a topic that I'm very passionate about. So HealthTap started with pregnant women and moms. We started with pediatricians and obstetricians, the two first populations, first two specialties that served only pregnant women and moms, exactly because of the reason that you said, because we believe that moms are the chief medical officer of the family. They take care of their health, their children's health, many times the health of their parents. And I think that there's a huge opportunity there. Also, moms are very health conscious, just in general, right? So we started there, and I think that you'll be surprised to actually discover, if you look at the news today, but actually today we are launching a new feature that's called Dr. Mom. We discovered that there are like more than 40,000 physicians in our network. We discovered that a lot of the users are still pregnant women and moms, and they ask questions, and when we ran some focus groups, we realized that they want to get answers not only from doctors, but they're actually interested to get the doctors that were moms before, because there's some experiential things, some caring, and something associated with that. So today, actually, we're announcing a new feature that's called Dr. Mom, that moms can actually go and ask other doctors questions and actually choose that their question goes to doctors who are also moms, and that's exactly the right reason.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I want Patrick and Mo to address the funding environment for this area. There's a lot of companies getting seed funding. How is this going from? How difficult is it for companies to get funding, seed, and then to Series A or beyond?
I mean, in my view, that's the question that I asked about the endless, what Mo called the perpetual pilots. In seed funding, our NEA's practice is that we have 4 criteria. Number 1, the team must be great because you're only investing in the team. Number 2, you've got to raise enough in the seed round to get you to a position where you'll be in a strong position to raise Series A. The third criterion, I think, is the most difficult for a $2.5 billion fund, which is if you get to the point where you're in a good position to raise Series A, that would actually be a Series A that a giant fund would want to do. And then fourth, because we are take passive stakes in our seed investments, we want to work with other top-tier co-investors. Now, the question you ask is, what does it take then to put yourself into a great position to raise Series A? It's going to be idiosyncratic for every single company, but in general, I'd say, number 1, you want to have a full-time team that we believe will be able to take you to Series B. You want to have that's number 1. Number 2, you want to have a launched product. And number 3, you want to have some early indication that the dogs are eating the dog food, that your product is actually working. It's not going to be high absolute numbers, but some slope of some curve that is meaningful should have a pretty high slope. And then fourth, to really knock it out of the park, if you have experimented with a bunch of business models and have some early indication that people are actually willing to pay for this or that somehow you're able to monetize it, I think that puts you in a great position to raise Series A. The tricky part about all of this is oftentimes we see seed companies come to us, it looks very promising, it's a great team, it's a phenomenal product, they've got a pilot with United and 1,000 other people do too. And they come to us at the end of the seed and they're kind of still there and the results are kind of okay and there are lots of excuses for why it wasn't widely deployed or why, there are lots of tweaking. And that's a difficult case to be in.
Yeah, just reiterate that. I think, especially in enterprise sales, if you have an enterprise contract, so you had the transition from pilot to a longer deal, that will hold you to invest them to get a Series A. But again, it's very idiosyncratic. It depends on your channel and what you do.
The only other consideration I'll just throw in very quickly, and this less relevant to sort of enterprise healthcare, more for consumer, is just the impact of Kickstarter and Indiegogo. You know, we've seen cool stuff like smartwatches on there, but we've also seen companies like Misfits, I think, launched on there. Even more established companies like Scanadu just launched a product on there. So I don't know if you guys want to comment on to what extent that's sort of filling this gap between seed and B, but I think that's a new dynamic in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it is. It's less for the high science biotech stuff, but I think, again, for a lot of these capital efficient models, especially consumer-focused stuff, there's other sources of capital out there.
I mean, to me, the whole crowdsourcing is it's cash. It's as green as our cash as well. The difference really is that if you genuinely need the help of a institutional investor or an angel investor, you're going to get that help. And in crowdsource kind of anonymous donations coming in, you get the money, but the money is often not the determinative factor to success.
So can I just ask Patrick and Mo, since you're in like multiple sectors, how does the capital requirements of a seed company that wants to be in healthcare differ from some of the other sectors that you're in?
Well, I mean, I do a lot of digital health, and it's actually, you know, they are genuinely technology, web-based companies, and so I don't see a lot of difference. Now, there's a world of difference when you're developing a drug or a medical device, and you got to start going to, you know, to get regulatory approval and all that stuff. But for the digital health side, so long as you steer clear of the FDA, I think it can be just as capital efficient as anything else. I mean, if you're developing a new telecom switch, you're still selling to a Cisco or a Juniper or whatever, and that's still a long sales cycle, just like United Health would be.
So there's been a lot of buzz about the lack of people who are stepping up to fund an A&B, and so companies are concerned. They're funded in seed, and there are a lot of people stepping into later stages. But can you comment on what you're seeing in the trend and who's stepping up to play in the A&B rounds?
There is capital there, but I don't think everything that gets seeded is going to get a Series A and Series B. I think your comment is just a reflection of there's a lot of money that's gone in from a C level because it's very capital efficient to do it. So there's hundreds of companies out there, and not all of them are going to get financing. And I think that's just a normal sort of cycle.
I think that it's really important to I talk about it from a company perspective, right? So we just raised our Series B recently, Aberdare Ventures, and we have investors in MDV and Mayfield and Herot and Innovation Endeavors, and you know, there are several investors out there that are starting to focus more on digital health. You know, and we were, you know, fortunate to work from the beginning with some of the best of them. You know, so MDV believed in us from the very beginning. Herot Schmidt, Innovation Endeavors, they're looking into health as well. You know, Mayfield Fund, definitely. You know, and now Aberdare Ventures that have a very, very strong focus on digital health. So I think that there are investors there that traditionally have been more focused on other things, and now they're looking at digital health. And I think that if you have a good idea, and like you know, they said, you just have some traction, and you have a good team, there are investors today that were not the traditional healthcare investors that will actually put money into great companies and do Series A's and Series B's and even beyond.
Just an observation on that. We've been tracking a lot of our deal flow in the space. You'll actually see a lot of market data that's very similar. What we've seen is, over the past year or so, for investors in the space, a vast majority of the investors make a single investment. So there are a lot of funds that are dipping their toe in the water. Mo and Patrick here are not unique, but they're a smaller population that make serial investments in the space. So a little bit is observation bias, that it's a very interesting space, it's hot. And so you're seeing folks from other industries take a shot at investing in digital health. So there is some observational bias that we're seeing.
But I will say, you know, because the dynamic you describe has often been lamented as the Series A crunch, where all these seed companies, and they get to the Series A, and none of them get Series A's, and it's a big disaster. I don't think it's a big disaster at all. I think it's actually a phenomenal development. And here's why. It's not as though you run out of seed, your experiment didn't work, and then you just pack it up and go home, and you never do anything for the rest of your life. I mean, that doesn't happen. What has happened is that because it's become so capital efficient to start a company. If you have a laptop and a broadband connection, you can start a company. And that wasn't the case a generation ago. And so with $500,000, you can run maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, I've got an entrepreneur who's on his 6th idea with, I think he raised $750,000. And a generation ago, that would have taken, each iteration would have taken you 3 years and probably single-digit millions. And so by the time you hit on something that is Series A worthy, you are a much better entrepreneur, the quality of your idea is much higher, you've got a lot more traction, and you've lived basically 3 to 5 lives of an entrepreneur that a generation ago you only could have afforded to live one of. And so to me, that's a very exciting prospect because the overall quality of the projects that get Series A financing are so much higher because the seed and the capital efficiency of the market has allowed you to become a better entrepreneur and to try more things more quickly and to learn from them.
Scott, were you tracking the investment of institutions or hospitals like Kaiser and others in this space? Are they doing anything?
So, yes, it's actually, to Ron's comment earlier, we're seeing a lot of new investors in space. Kaiser has, Kaiser Ventures that's very active in the space. We're also seeing other folks that are non-traditional. As you're talking to folks like Comcast. Comcast Ventures is active, Qualcomm Ventures is active. So there are a lot of players beyond just kind of the traditional sandhill VCs.
Are they going one or multiple investments?
I think it's still too early to tell. We're seeing them come in at an early stage, which is a little bit unusual for them. We're seeing them do, more recently, the last couple that I've done, they're doing it historically how some of the old pharma deals were done. They're collaborations, so they're an investment, but they're also a partnership to deliver that application within their enterprise. So I think you're going to see a lot of novelty around deal structure on how these are formulated and done.
Yeah, and just out of that, so we've taken strategic money from many of our companies, say at Series B, and what they do bring is actually revenue. So if they bring a channel behind them, it makes a lot of sense for us because, again, many of the things that we've talked about are the issues of distribution. So if I can get Sandbox, which I've done before for one deal, they bring the blues with them, and instantly you get revenue and live management. Ascension is very similar from the healthcare perspective. There's a new fund in Nashville called Heritage, where all the LPs are hospital systems who actually vote on the investment decisions, and then if they do a deal, they sort of guarantee revenue. So those are really interesting opportunities.
But one of the things why you generally don't get strategic money early on is then you get tied to somebody. There are a lot of rivalries here. How do you avoid the rivalries of getting a little bit of strategic help from one when you can't land to it at the same time because of the ambiguity of money?
Great question. So I'll go back to the Humedica story. So the Series B was led by Gutman, which helped with distribution. But it was a company that was monetizing throughout the ecosystem. So by signing an EMR, yes, it sort of prevented us from doing other EMR work. That was fine. We were selling to pharma, and there was provider systems, and then a payer board in the end. So again, back to the way many of the things in this ecosystem are attractive to many players out there.
So in other words, you're willing to tough it out, even if there's a special deal already tied in that.
Yeah, I'm willing to restrict working with 7 EMRs if I can work with one who will guarantee revenue and then completely lower my cost of distribution. Absolutely.
One reason there might be 40,000 health apps out there is because there's 40,000 different answers when you ask the question of what would you do next, how to be healthy and so on. And it's actually, in my opinion, a rather dismal state right now, and where we think we know more than we do. So what I mean is, the battle is raging when you try to figure out what to do as a health consumer for your health. You will find doctors who will put you on a whole grain diet, and another doctor will put you on a no grain diet. This doctor,
we don't know.
What's that?
Because we don't know.
Because we don't know. This one will tell you to do a bunch of cardio. This one will say resistance and no cardio. This one will put you on a high fat. This will put you on a low fat. Even something as traditional as cholesterol is being challenged now. And you have groups of doctors forming to sort of clear the good name of cholesterol, that it's really an innocent bystander. And it's the inflammation that matters. And so it's just like, it can be perilous now to sort of have an app that just like tells you what to do, because, I mean, you can find so many conflicting studies. Somehow the peer review process and the control study thing hasn't really shed a lot of light on what is actually healthy and what to do. Maybe this is for Patrick, I don't know, is the crowd thing going to be what frees us from this, and when can we expect it to?
I think the crowd story is early, so the answer is I don't know, and no one here knows. But here's what I find encouraging. There are always going to be outliers. There are always going to be splinter groups. Like climate change, there was that splinter group that says it says, and they just get marginalized as you go forward. If you look at the company that I talked about earlier, CrowdMed, At the beginning, the stock market, the futures market is incredibly stochastic, and then all of a sudden a single disease usually rises out of the muck and stabilizes. And at that point he calls it and says that's the disease. In the genome-wide association study, replication studies that we did for chronic disease, same thing. It's just very, very clear at the end. And you see this in context after context after context, which gives me a lot of faith that it will, the truth will, or a good approximation of the truth will emerge. When Wikipedia first got up to the scene, I thought, oh my God, what a disaster that's going to be. You know, you get an entry for the United States. If someone can just cross it out and say the United States is the province of Russia, it's just going to be junk. And like 10 years later, Wikipedia is actually pretty darn good. And I think it harkens back to that old fair game where you have a cow in the middle of the field and everyone guesses the weight of the cow, and no individual guess is better than the average of all guesses. And you just see that dynamic again and again and again. So I can't answer your question, but I personally have faith that it will approximate the truth.
I want to add something to it. I think that the truth of the matter is, like Mohit said, that more than half of medicine is still art. The other half is science, and I'm being generous. So we want to believe it's a different thing, but it's not. But the thing that we really want to think about here is, I'm curious about CrowdMed as well, and I'm watching it, and I think it's an interesting experiment. What is going to be valuable in the short term is bringing the physician community to create transparency into what a lot of physicians think, not about what individual, because when you go to one physician, you get one opinion. If you are very industrious, you're going to go to 3 physicians, then 3 opinions. But I'm curious to see what 500 physicians think about the same question, right? So what we're doing is basically bringing your question to many physicians and bubbling up the answers, right? Creating transparency. What we're creating is a meritocracy, where physicians compete with each other on who will answer the best question. And not only that, we have this notion of peer review on HealthTap that is visible, not the article peer review in the peer-reviewed journals, but actually to your question. You ask a question, and then physicians compete among themselves who's smarter, right? And then it's visible to everyone. So what's interesting is not what one physician answers to your question, but what does the physician community think about your question, which is exactly what Patrick said, right? So you start seeing the patterns that are really interesting. So
I think there's an important but subtle point here, which is like, and it's not just a matter of gathering more data points. I mean, that's helpful. But look at the Wikipedia example. There's actually a very elaborate social structure that's evolved around Wikipedia to do all the editing. And I think that's what Ron's getting at, is that you don't just aggregate the numbers, but you come up with a mechanism for vetting them and deciding which ones to believe.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to reiterate a bit more that. So I think there's actually 2 issues that we discussed. So one is rare diseases. There's a well-defined diagnosis, but it's just hard to find. I think crowdsourcing is a great mechanism, and I'd love to hear more about it as it develops. The other issue that you define is actually a problem of medicine for decades and generations and hundreds of years, is that actually much of disease is really an epiphenomenon, but we classify it because we just don't know it well enough. So cancer is a great example. It turns out lung cancer isn't just lung cancer. We have a joint company called Clovis, which is trying to figure out the subtypes and how do you really define what cancer is. It's actually many types. So to disrupt that, and that problem is where I think the 23andMe and the sort of the genomic sequencing companies are going to go, because I would love to flip medicine on its side, right? We live in a world of randomized control trials, which is, again, the average. What I prefer is that we get sequenced, and then they know they can match that up to a set of drugs, and whether the drug is used for that indication or not, which I think will be irrelevant as time goes on, because we'll figure out the specific agent for us individually. And that will solve your problem, but again, we're not there as yet, but that's where we're moving towards.
I think that's a great comment for us to end on. If you could join me, thank you for the